One of the most common questions that I get around citing sources is telling the difference between a website only and a journal article that you are getting on the web. Now, that may seem kind of like the same thing, but once you see the resources, they're two very different types of resources. So here I am at scholar.google.com. Of course, you can use the library and the databases within the library, but Google Scholar is essentially just an open source database. And I'm going to put in just some basic, Boolean terms, climate change, coral reefs, to see what I would get. Now on scholar.google.com, this is going to be a database search engine that is really going to be looking for primary literature. Sometimes there'll be books and different reports, but for the most part, this is a tool to try and focus the research on a article that would be primary. It doesn't mean it's always that way, but it's going to be a much different search result than if we just went to google.com. So here we have a ton of different options. With just climate change and coral reefs, we have about 236,000 results. Over here we can change how we want to have those filtered if we want to, but right now we're just looking at the difference between a peer-reviewed journal article. Peer-reviewed journal articles are also called primary sources. And I'm going to go down here. So over on here on the right, these are showing that there are open source options for you. And if you are signed into the library in your personal account, then a lot of times that will populate this with even more options. Remember, you never want to pay for any journals. You always want to make sure that you are getting access either directly through the library or through open source options, and never pay for class primary literature. So here we go. Science Direct is going to be a database. So if I click on this here, this is going to be an example of a peer-reviewed journal article. This lives in paper out in the world, but we are looking at a digital version of it. Now we could download this as PDF. If you're not signed into the library, then it would ask you to pay. And I didn't sign into the library before I started this video, so if I was signed into the library account, then I would be able to download this or go directly to the library and pull it. But you can see that it's kind of giving you some information, and anything that is going to be a primary literature is going to have not only a title, but the authors, and it will have their affiliation, the date, it will have a volume, usually number, and an issue number. So this is going to be an example. Even though it's a website, it is a copy of a primary article. So we would cite it as a journal article. You see the volume and issue number up here, and then the pages that it is contained. So let's compare it to if we just did a normal Google search and we did the same terms, climate change, coral reefs. So something like oceanservice.noaa.gov is a top hit. Let's take a look at that. So this would be an example of just a website. So this is not a journal article. This has never been sent out in print to anyone. And like for this one, I can get a print copy of this because it's a paper, just like a book. One way to think about it is that looking at these primary articles is kind of like reading a physical book, but you're reading it on a Kindle, okay? But you're just still going to cite it as a journal article. Something like this, where you use the URL, is going to be just a website only. So a website only, even though this is a reputable website through our NOAA organization, the National Oceanic Service, this is going to only exist in a website form. And we could cite this, but it's not going to be primary literature. It's not going to be a peer-reviewed journal. So we would need to cite this as a website. So let's take another look at a journal article. Let's see if we can get a PDF version. Let's take a look at this, see what this is here. So this is going to download to my desktop. Let's see if it'll let me open it from here. So this is a review article. This would be depending on where it was published. So this was published in Science Magazine, which is a great publisher of scientific content, and this would be something that you would cite as a journal paper. And you'll also notice that in journal papers, they're going to have a literature cited section, sometimes called a bibliography or references, and that's another clue to get that. One last thing is if you're in scholar.google.com, there is this ability to take a look at citation references. Now, we're citing our sources in CSE Name Your Style, part of which is that is the way that in biology we use that particular citation style. But also I want you to get used to being able to understand what goes into a citation and not just copy and pasting from a citation manager. If you are interested in seeing how other ways you can cite things, you can just go to these little quotation marks there, and Google will give you these top options. You'll notice that CSE Name Your Style is not in there, and that's by design because I want you to be able to create these citations by hand before you go to just a tool so that you know what you're doing. You're not just copying and pasting. So for example, then this would help us, especially if you're used to APA. Okay, so this is the author. That's the year that it was published. That's the name of the article. Here is the article journal that it was published in, the volume and issue, and the pages. So that can also help you take a look that this is going to be something that is a journal article, and a website is not going to have all this information. So you don't need to put, if we went back to the original one here, again, even though we are looking at a website, we're not going to include this URL here because we're just looking at a PDF copy of something that is in print, and you only include the URL in the citation when it is a website only. Another way to look at that, if we took a look at the citations at the bottom, you'll see that they are going to be in this format, and the only time a URL is used is going to designate that it's a website only. And in a journal article that got published, generally they're never going to be using a website only as a reference because websites constantly change. So once a journal article is published, unless there's a retraction, it is what it is. It's not going to change, and that way it can be a reliable source. Websites are constantly changing, and websites are very fluid. They're meant to be fluid, and that's why it's important to have that designation in between the two. So for this particular one, we could download a PDF and we could have that on our desktop if we wanted to, and it would be the same version that someone would then read 10 years from now. However, this URL, this website, is not going to be the same piece of information in the same way 10 years from now. So that's kind of like the big difference. One last toss would be a DOI. So DOI is going to be a publication reference, especially for journal papers that only are published digitally and not published in paper. Really, if it's a journal paper, you don't necessarily need to include DOI for our terms and purposes. Not all papers are going to have a DOI. It's more complicated than we need to worry about for our purposes. But if you have a DOI with your citation, feel free to include it if it's a journal article. But don't worry about it because it's still a bit new, and we don't need it, especially if you have everything else from that citation that allow you to create the CSE Name Your Style journal citation, which would be, the authors, the year, the name of the article, where it's published, the volume, the issue as appropriate, and then the pages that it would be included in the larger journal. And that's all you need. So hopefully that helps to create some clarity on a journal paper versus a website only, so that when you are citing your sources, you know the difference between the two.